Never put your own money into business unless you absolutely have to. A new business project need not have substantial startup capital requirement, nor does one have to be a millionaire to start an entrepreneurial business endeavor. Neither a building nor a fully furnished office be made a requisite to be able to open the business. In fact, many entrepreneurs have commenced their businesses out of shoestring capital or with little amount as what is in the savings account. Others literally do not have money or capital, but have good business ideas and the guts, as well as courage to start the business using someone else's money. If one has good idea worth pursuing in a business and the person concerned has all that entrepreneurial traits, the problem should not be much of a capital or money burden per se, but on more finding or sourcing the capital. And this chapter will be all about that. It will teach us how to finance our future business. Capital requirements are standardized regulations in place for banks and other depository institutions that determine how much liquid capital must be held via a certain level of their assets. Also known as regulatory capital, these standards are set by regulatory agencies such as the Bank for International Settlements, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and the Federal Reserve Board. An angry public and an easy investment climate usually prove to be the catalyst for legislative reform in capital requirements, especially when irresponsible financial behavior by large institutions is seen as the culprit behind a financial crisis, market crash, or recession. Capital requirements are set to ensure that banks and depository institutions' holdings are not dominated by investments that increase the risk of default. They also ensure that banks and depository institutions have enough capital to sustain operating losses while still honoring withdrawals. Capital requirements aim not only to keep banks solvent, but by extension to keep the entire financial system on a safe footing. In an era of national and international finance, no bank is an island, as regulatory advocates note. A shock to one can affect many. So all the more reason for stringent standards that can be applied consistently and used to compare the different soundness of institutions. Still, capital requirements have their critics. They charge that higher capital requirements have the potential to reduce bank risk-taking and competition in the financial sector. By mandating banks to keep a certain percentage of assets liquid, the requirements can inhibit the institution's ability to invest and make money, and thus extend credit to customers. Maintaining certain levels of capital can increase their cost, which in turn increases cost for borrowing or other services for consumers. These are the pros and cons of capital requirements. Pros: they ensure banks to stay solvent and to avoid default. They ensure depositors have access to funds. They set industry standards, and they provide way to compare and evaluate institutions. Cons: they raise costs for banks and eventually consumers, and they inhibit banks' ability to invest. Also, they reduce availability of credit and loans. From an entrepreneur's viewpoint, capital is not all about or does not necessarily mean money. In fact, some entrepreneurs consider an innovative idea, as a form of capital that is much more precious than money. From financial viewpoint, however, capital comes in monetary terms and in three forms as follows. First, the fixed capital. Fixed capital includes the assets and capital investments such as property, plant, and equipment that are needed to start up and conduct business, even at a minimal stage. These assets are considered fixed in that they are not consumed or destroyed during the actual production of a good or service but have a usable value. Fixed capital investments are typically depreciated on the company's accounting statements over a long period of time, up to 20 years or more. The concept of fixed capital was first introduced in the 18th century by the political economist David Ricardo. For Ricardo, fixed capital referred to any kind of physical asset that is not used up in the production of a product. This was opposed to Ricardo's idea of circulating capital, such as raw materials, operating expenses, and labor. In Martian economics, fixed capital is closely related to the concept of constant capital. Fixed capital is the portion of total capital outlay of a business invested in physical assets, such as factories, vehicles, and machinery that stay in the business almost permanently, or more technically, for more than one accounting period. Fixed assets can be purchased and owned by a business, or they can be structured as a long-term lease. On the other side of the capital equation is that which circulates, or which is consumed by a company in the process of production. This includes raw materials, labor, operating expenses, and more. Marx emphasized that the distinction between fixed and circulating capital is relative, since it refers to the comparative turnover times of various types of physical capital assets. Fixed capital also circulates, except that the turnover time is far longer because a fixed asset may be held for several years or decades before it has yielded its value and is discarded for its salvage value. A fixed asset may be resold and reused at any time before its useful life is over, which often happens with vehicles and airplanes. Fixed capital can be contrasted with variable capital, the cost and level of which change over time, and with the scale of a company's output. For instance, machinery used in the production would be considered fixed capital, as it would remain with a company regardless of current output levels. Raw materials, on the other hand, would fluctuate depending on output levels. The amount of fixed capital needed to set up a business is quite particular to each situation, especially from industry to industry. Some lines of business require a large number of fixed capital assets. Common examples include industrial manufacturers, telecommunications providers, and oil exploration firms. Service-based industries, such as accounting firms, have more limited fixed capital needs. This can include office buildings, computers, networking devices, and other standard office equipment. While production businesses often have easier access to the inventory necessary to create the goods being produced, the procurement of fixed capital can be lengthy. It may take a business a significant amount of time to generate the funds necessary for larger purchases, such as new production facilities. If a company uses financing, that may take time as well to obtain proper loans. This can increase the risk of financial losses associated with low production if a company experiences an equipment failure and does not have redundancy built in. Fixed capital investments typically don't depreciate in the even way that is shown on the income statements. Some devalue quite quickly, while others have nearly infinite usable lives. For example, a new vehicle loses significant value when it is officially transferred from the dealership to the new owner. In contrast, company-owned buildings may depreciate at a much lower rate. The depreciation method allows investors to see a rough estimate of how much value fixed capital investments are contributing to the current performance of the company. While fixed capital often maintains a level of value, these assets are not considered very liquid in nature. This is due to the limited market for certain items, such as manufacturing equipment, or the high price involved and the time it takes to sell a fixed asset, which is usually lengthy. Working capital, also known as net working capital, is a difference between a company's current assets, such as cash, accounts receivable or customers' unpaid bills, inventories of raw materials and finished goods, and its current liabilities such as accounts payable and debts. Working capital is a measure of a company's liquidity, operational efficiency, and short-term financial health. If a company has substantial positive working capital, then it should have the potential to invest and grow. If a company's current assets do not exceed its current liabilities, then it may have trouble growing or paying back creditors, or even go bankrupt. Working capital estimates are derived from the array of assets and liabilities on a corporate balance sheet. Current assets listed include cash, accounts receivable, inventory, and other assets that are expected to be liquidated or turned into cash in less than 1 year. Current liabilities include accounts payable, wages, taxes payable, and the current portion of long-term debt due within 1 year. To calculate working capital, compare the former to the latter. Specifically, subtract one from the other. The standard formula for working capital is current assets minus current liabilities. A company has negative working capital if its ratio of current assets to liabilities is less than 1. Positive working capital indicates that a company can fund its current operations and invest in future activities and growth. Working capital that is in line with or higher than the industry average for a company of comparable size is generally considered acceptable. Low working capital may indicate a risk of distress or default. Most major new projects, such as an expansion in production or into new markets, require an investment in working capital that reduces cash flow. But cash flow will also fall if money is collected too slowly or if sales volumes are decreasing, which will lead to a fall in accounts receivable. Companies that are usually working capital inefficiently can boost cash flow by squeezing suppliers and customers. On the other hand, high working capital isn't always a good thing. It might indicate that the business has too much inventory or is not investing its excess cash. Working capital is calculated by taking a company's current assets and deducting current liabilities. Working capital is calculated by taking a company's current assets and deducting current liabilities. For instance, if a company has current assets of 100,000 pesos and a current liabilities of 80,000 pesos, then its working capital would be 20,000 pesos. Common examples of current assets include cash, accounts receivable, and inventory. Examples of current liabilities include accounts payable, short-term debt payments, or the current portion of deferred revenue. Working capital is important because it is necessary in order for businesses to remain solvent. In theory, a business could become bankrupt even if it is profitable. After all, a business cannot rely on paper profits in order to pay its bills. Those bills need to be paid in cash readily in hand. Say a company has accumulated 1 million in cash due to its previous year's retained earnings. If the company were to invest all 1 million at once, it could find itself in insufficient current assets to pay for its current liabilities. Growth capital, or capital appreciation, is an increase in the value of an asset or investment over time. Growth capital is measured by the difference between the current value or market value of an asset or investment and its purchase price, or the value of the asset or investment at the time it was acquired. The extent of capital growth that's favorable depends on the investor involved and the investment objectives. The investment objective varies among investors, depending on their level of risk tolerance. Investors with low risk tolerance are likely to seek income, while investors with high risk tolerance are likely to seek capital growth. Growth capital investment objectives can be classified into moderate growth and high growth. An investor seeking moderate capital growth might invest in equities of stable companies, such as blue chip stocks. On the other hand, an investor seeking high capital growth might invest in more speculative investments, or growth stocks. Growth stocks are often companies with little profit or earnings, history that offers the promise of high growth in the future. Equities and real estate are two of the most common investments used for capital growth. While these asset classes can have income components, equities through dividends and real estate through rental income, investors with a capital growth investment objective are usually seeking price appreciation. A typical strategy for investors seeking capital growth is to allocate to different investments in a portfolio so that it's diversified. Diversification helps to reduce risk in a portfolio by spreading the investments between different asset classes, such as stocks and bonds. The asset allocation would be determined by various factors, such as the investor's objective, risk tolerance, and investment horizon. For example, investors in their 20s would likely opt for more equities or growth companies in their portfolio since they have a long time horizon. On the other hand, investors who are close to retirement might opt for more bonds than equities in their portfolio to create growth with less risk. The investment objectives and the risk factors would also determine the equity allocation between moderate capital growth investments and high capital growth investments. Each portfolio is different, and each investor's definition of risk is subjective. Types of growth capital investments. Exchange-traded funds and mutual funds are funds that contain a basket of securities, including stocks or bonds that help investors either diversify risk or target a specific sector. There are exchange-traded funds and funds that mirror the diversified and those that contain only bank stocks, which is sector-specific. Equities. High-growth stocks might include technology and biotechnology companies, since they often can appreciate significantly over time. However, there is more risk associated with this type of stocks, since some of them have to be profitable. Also, not all technology stocks might be growth stocks. For example, some might argue Microsoft Corporation is a well-established company that produces safe and stable returns. Stocks of companies that have the best capital growth prospects typically do not pay dividends. Dividends are payments to shareholders as a reward for owning shares in a company. Dividends are paid from a company's retained earnings, which is a savings account of accumulated profits over the years. As a result, companies that pay dividends tend to be well-established, consistently profitable corporations. Companies that don't pay dividends are more interested in generating higher future returns. These growth-focused companies reinvest their profits to fund research and development or to expand operations or in infrastructure. Bonds. Bonds issued by the Treasury Department are considered risk-free investments. However, they tend to underperform equities when it comes to capital growth. Bonds are typically used for income since most of them pay a fixed interest rate to bondholders. Real estate investment trust. Investors who like the idea of investing in the real estate industry but don't want to own real estate per se can invest in REITs. REITs are funds that contain a portfolio of commercial real estate properties, which can include malls, apartment complexes, hotels, office buildings, and warehouses. REITs offer payments to investors as they distribute the rental income received from their properties.
Hi everyone, this is Jeremy Delacas and I'm going to tackle about sources of capital.
After going through the difficulties of drafting a business plan, entrepreneurs will be faced with the task of finding finance if they don't have enough personal cash to support the venture. Funds required by the firm can be raised either internally or externally. Internal fund sources refers to those finance that are owned by the entrepreneur or the company, whereas the external sources refers to those beyond the means of the entrepreneur or the business organization.
Aside from internal and external sources, capital may be sourced from different sources as discussed hereunder.
Let's start with formal and informal sources. Formal sources refers to borrowing funds from an organization or institution that have been lawfully authorized by the government to provide financial aid or other types of support to business and institutions. Informal sources, on the other hand, refers to funding sources other than those required by law to give capital or finance to businesses. Next is owner's equity. The contribution of the owner to the capital is known as equity in a corporation, and the Holders of stock certificates are known as
Stockholders.
As the result, if funds are needed to expand the business or open a branch, the business organization can look to its owners or stockholders as an immediate source of funds, which can be accomplished through additional equity infusions or personal loans to the business as a whole. Third is long-term borrowing. Long-term borrowing is a term used to describe organizations whose primary purpose is to provide financial help. Banks and mortgages, for example, lend cash or capital with long-term repayment terms, such as 1 to 3 years for medium-term loan and 3 years or more for long-term loans. Mortgages, bonds, and long-term commercial papers are examples of possible funding sources. So what are these three? Let's start with mortgage. A mortgage is a type of loan that is obtained by pledging a specific property as security or collateral for the loan. The corporation can mortgage its equipment or real estate holdings to the bank if necessity arises. And next is bonds. In its most simplest form, bonds is a loan made by the investor to a borrower, such as a corporation or the government. The borrower owes money to run its business, while the investor earns interest on his or her investment. And the next examples of funding sources is the long-term commercial papers. Long-term commercial papers, or LCPs, are commercial documents issued by large enterprises with a track record of success. Like bonds, LCP are guaranteed a fixed return by the issuer, and so LCP holders are renting returns by purchasing the LCP, regardless of the issuer's operating results.
Good day everyone, I am Janet Ting, and in my part of this discussion, I'll be discussing the short-term creditors, the types of creditors, venture capital companies, its other sources, and lastly the angel investors. I'm gonna start this with the definition of the short-term creditors. So short-term creditors takes the form of financiers on a short-term basis lasting to 1 year or less. In some cases, they include fund providers who may not demand voluminous documents like business plan or feasibility studies. These creditors can serve as a standby credit facility to the entrepreneurs, which can be tapped as needed. When properly nurtured, short-term creditors can be tapped for cash needs or inventory, even by simply using the phone or a brief visit to its offices to sign some papers. So next we move on to the types of creditors. There are 7 types of creditors: the commercial banks, merchandise suppliers, credit card companies, capital equipment suppliers, leasing companies, receivable factors, and lastly, the 7th one, deferral of payables in general. We're gonna tackle first the commercial banks. So, as its charter provides, commercial banks are duty-bound to provide both short-term and long-term financing to any viable business project. While banks prefer loans and financing on a medium or long-term basis, there are special financing packages involving short-term financing for periods of 6 months or even less. For an export-oriented business, entrepreneurs should explore special financing package normally offered by export banks or those that are specifically mandated by the government. Export banks are authorized to offer attractive credit terms to domestic manufacturers and foreign buyers of their goods. So next, the second one, merchandise suppliers. The company's inventory or stock can be procured either through cash or credit terms. Entrepreneurs that can stock their shelves with items procured on credit terms are not only daring but smart entrepreneurs as well. Credit terms with the merchandise suppliers being a form of financing should be explored to the fullest with the merchandise suppliers. Terms like consignment basis, layaway plans, and similar arrangement can be made with the suppliers. This will spare the entrepreneurs hard cash that can be used for some other purposes or simply deposited in the bank or invested in high-yielding instruments. Depending on the quality of the relationship between the company and merchandise suppliers, some suppliers provide such terms as pay when able or payment terms up to 120 days. New business ventures are also prospective business partners of merchandise suppliers, and they can be the best of friends on a long-term basis. Such relationships can be nurtured such that suppliers can provide short-term capital in terms of credit privileges for the raw materials and production inputs that are needed by the entrepreneur. The third type of creditor would be the credit card companies. Credit card is the most convenient yet the most expensive loan terms you can find in town. Credit cards are actually one of the most overlooked avenues in obtaining startup capital. Though it offers stringent term loan, it would appear as cheap no because one does not need to have business plan or collateral to get the amount needed. All that is needed by a credit card bearing entrepreneur is to walk to the ATM machine and withdraw the amount needed. If the entrepreneur is only looking at home-based business that generally needs lesser capital, the amount can be easily raised if you have several cards, or a group of 5 or more persons forming corporation can easily combine their credit card limit and instantly start the business using the credit card. For instance, a group of 5 investor or incorporators holding a Citibank Visa card or MasterCard with a 50,000 credit limit each can instantly raise 75,000 cash in a matter of minutes, which is more than enough for a small business, or they can put up a corporation with 1 million authorized capitalization with fully paid up stock portion under the minimum requirements as mandated by law. The option to tap credit card should be made with prudence and extreme precautions, or a last resort, because most credit card companies charge extremely high, if not exorbitant rates. So the fourth one would be the capital equipment suppliers. In their desire to sell equipment, suppliers will often make every favorable term available even to new companies. This is possible because the equipment itself secures the loan. The contract may be a lease held by the seller or leasing company, or conditional sales agreement whereby the seller retains ownership or title until the last installment payment is made and received. So next, the fifth one will be the leasing companies. They make possible the procurement of capital items or equipment for the company. This arrangement, however, can work the other way around if the entrepreneur holds the design of the capital equipment. In such case, capital equipment suppliers can make it possible for entrepreneurs to buy the equipment, especially if it is custom designed or one-of-a-kind equipment. So the sixth one is the receivable factors. There are many specialized organizations like credit and collection companies or even individuals who will take the risk of buying receivables at discounted rates. By selling the receivables, the entrepreneur is relieved of the delay and cost of collection efforts, at the same time generate funds needed by the business. So the last type of creditor would be the seventh one, deferral of payables in general. When the economy is in a difficult situation, or there are industry or region-wide financial crisis, or when the money position of the company is tight, most companies lag behind in their payments of bills and loans. Entrepreneurs should not be afraid or ashamed to negotiate for payment of bills and loans by not necessarily or immediately going into reconstructing agreement. Moreover, entrepreneurs should not overlook the fact that in financial crisis periods, some of the employees might be willing to defer portions of their salary or other benefits either as gesture of solidarity, loyalty, fellowship, or practical measures to avoid being laid off. So after the short-term creditors and the types of creditors, we then move on to the next one, the venture capital companies. Venture capital companies refer to private and for-profit organizations that provide funds to new business venture by way of purchasing equity positions in new or young businesses believed to have potential to produce maximum returns within short period of time. With funding provided for by venture capital companies, the entrepreneur surrenders a portion of the ownership and control of the business as representatives of the venture capital companies generally. Like all financiers, venture capital corporations or venture capitalists are interested in the financial track record of the company in case it is an old one or the profit potential in case of the new ventures. More importantly, however, is that venture capital organizations are more concerned with the future profit potential the business investments offer. As a result, venture capital companies invest funds in returns for the share of ownership or a certain degree of control in business operations, unlike banks that are more concerned with the payment of loan amount borrowed. Other than the immediate return of investments, some venture capital companies do seek foothold trying to develop long-term capital gains. Venture capital companies hope to make an attractive profit when they sell their equity at any time they feel necessary. Because of direct involvement in the operation of the business of venture capital companies through its representative or nominees, prospective entrepreneurs have certain advantage in that they could avail of expertise of venture capitalists on the matter of overall management of the company, and more particularly on the matter of financial and marketing management. Prospective entrepreneurs can inquire with organizations of venture capital firms or commercial banks, as some of them have subsidiary corporations or establishments that operates as a venture capital organizations or which provides a similar form of services. A visit can be made also in Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas or Securities and Exchange Commission for the listing of duly authorized venture capital companies. So, other sources, other than the mentioned sources, there are other fund sources, some of which are in fact more advantageous to the prospective entrepreneurs. We have 8 other sources, and those are lending investors, government institutions, non-government institutions, political sources, friends and relatives, purchase other financing, employees, and users. So first, we're gonna tackle the lending investors. These are small business organizations duly licensed by the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas to provide quick financing with less paperwork as compared to commercial lending sources like the banks. These organizations generally conduct a one-time credit investigation, including visits to the entrepreneur's residence and actual site of business, after which a standing credit limit is approved or considered set as a standing credit limit. Entrepreneurs' need for fund is satisfied by simply filling up application forms or contract and cash delivered thereafter and right on the spot. These organizations generally require collateral like car registration, certificates, real estate documents or certificates or land titles, or post-dated checks corresponding to the monthly or regular amortization schedule agreed upon. So the second one would be the government institutions. These are special government financing packages meant for entrepreneurs in need of funds as seed capital, or assistance to those in dire need of funds, like victims of calamities or highly entrepreneurial individuals. All that is needed here are endorsement by barangay officials or other forms of documentation, sometimes including submission of project studies. Though its various agencies and instrumentalities, the government has number of financing programs meant for small and medium-scale enterprises and livelihood opportunities whose terms and conditions are better off compared with that of commercial banks. So the third one would be the non-government organizations. There are non-government organizations whose mandates or major programs are really meant for upcoming small-scale entrepreneurs and providing financial assistance to the underprivileged. These NGOs charge lesser interest rates and with more noble intention as compared to commercial loan providers. An example of this NGO is the Tulay sa Pag-unlad, Heifer Project International, Plan International, and host of other NGO just waiting to be tapped for socially oriented or business venture geared towards self-help and livelihood opportunities. So the fourth one would be political sources. Relationship with politicians can go a long way. Some politicians are philanthropists and are therefore in a position to provide grants or financial assistance for self-employment and livelihood projects without bothering to pay later. Or these politicians are real entrepreneurs themselves who has the capital and resources or means to broker business deals that can lead to big ticket projects and windfall profits to entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs, though, have to be extra careful. However, as politicians, money and power can be used against the entrepreneur sometime later, that it might lead to repentance and frustration. So the fifth one would be friends and relatives. They are abound or just around willing to be tapped. However, not all friends are available for aid in times of financial needs, such as putting up a business project. For sure, however, most friends and relatives would be around to help or assist a budding entrepreneur for him or her to succeed in business projects. It is therefore worth it to have a network and multitude of friends or relatives only to have a multitude and variety of parties who could offer financial capital that are relatively cheap compared to commercial banking sources. So the sixth one would be purchase order financing, also called PO financing. This scheme can be arranged with commercial banks or financing institution like the Technology and Livelihood Resource Center. Standing arrangement can be made with the bank or financing institution whereby for a fee, the bank will finance the production requirement of the company and upon delivery of the goods to the client. Payment will be made by the client directly to the bank or financing institution. The bank or financing institution will then retain the finance transaction plus the fees or charges and remit to the entrepreneur the amount presumed to be equivalent to his gross margin. So the next one would be employees. Never underestimate the employees. Nobody has a greater stake in health of the company other than the entrepreneur or the owner and the employees. Thus, for corporations seeking to expand capital base, possibility for having an employee stock option plan should be explored. This will not only answer the capital needs of the firm, but it could be also a vehicle for lifelong partnership between capital and labor, and would also reinforce the loyalty of the employees towards the firm. So last but not the least, the users. It may sound as a bad source of financing on account of there being illegal fund sources and charging high financing rates. Unknown to many, is the fact that users have helped 1,000 and more small entrepreneurs, mostly in sari-sari store business, to bankroll their daily financial needs. Unlike formal sources of funds or short-term creditors, users do not demand collaterals and business plans to avail of financing. In the long term, this scenario and their being operating illegally can work to the favor of the entrepreneurs. Unlawful as they are, they can last recourse of financial source, which in the long term could be beneficial to the entrepreneur as compared to the legally existing fund provides. So after the sources, let's get right into the next one, which is the angel investors. While it is true that entrepreneur's concern is the profit motive for himself, it is also a noble idea to share with others not only the profit aspects, but also the risk and burdens of the business. Hence, entrepreneurs may share startup capital with private investors called angels, as referred by the Entrepreneurs magazine. Unlike borrowing fresh capital from other sources who will charge you interest, money from private investors or angels are not loans or interest-bearing capital sourced outside your pocket. Enlist the support of other parties as equity investors. The equity investors themselves stand to possibly earn more rewards or interest compared to when the same money was invested elsewhere. Equity financing such as those provided by angel investors, whether they are your friends or relatives, means dividing your business ownership among investors who contribute capital, who may or may not participate in the operation or management of the business. There is no loan associated with equity capital, and there is no obligation placed on you to pay back the amount invested. All the investors get is the percentage in the profits of the business and the losses or profits associated with it. Equity capital may at first glance seems like the best way to raise your startup capital, but there are drawbacks. First, you give up a portion of your business and with it some kind of control measure that these investors may want. Second, you might unwillingly relinquish ownership or control of the company sometime in the future. So that's the last one for my part of this discussion. Thank you.
So to continue the discussion, I'm going to discuss the stock market and the IPO. So stock market refers to the collection of markets and exchanges where regular activities of buying, selling, and issuance of shares of publicly held companies take place. So there can be multiple stock trading venues in a country or a region which allow transactions in stocks and other forms of securities. So from the word buying and selling. So ang company ay no nga kabalo na mo og usa ni siyang stock market. So to elaborate this, to explain like kanang gamay ra pud nga explanation is that kana bitaw nga naay stock ang usa ka company. So ang usa ka tawo is ang stock ngadto is iya siyang paliton so that kanang mahimo siya na usa sa mga shareholders sa company mo na siya gitawag nga investors. Okay. The initial public offering or the IPO refers to the process of offering shares of a private corporation to the public in a new stock issuance. An IPO allows a company to raise capital from public investors. The transitions from a private to a public company can be an important time for a private investors to fully realize gains from their investment, as it typically includes a share premium for current private investors. Meanwhile, it also allows public investors to participate in the offering. Further, para mas makasabot mo og unsay meaning anang IPO, so let's watch this video.
What is an IPO? Presented by WallStreetSurvivor.com. An initial public offering, or IPO, is the very first time a private company issues stock to the public. A company can decide to issue stock for a number of reasons, including to raise money for growth, or to allow employees, owners, and early investors to liquidate some of their shares and make money. To explain how an IPO works, let's look at Dave. Dave owns a chain of very successful food trucks in Chicago. But Dave sees a bigger future for his business and wants to expand his operation to other cities. To do so, he decides to issue shares to the public to raise the necessary cash he needs to build more trucks, inventory, marketing, and staff. Dave can't just issue stock himself to the public. He needs to use an investment bank. If the IPO is big enough, a company can use multiple investment banks. But since Dave's offering is small, he uses one, J.P. Stanley. Based on the value of Dave's company, Dave and J.P. Stanley determine the IPO price, the amount of shares they will use, and the percentage of ownership of Dave's food trucks they will give up. J.P. Stanley values Dave's food trucks at $100 million, and Dave decides to sell 10% of his company. 10% of $100 million means Dave will be raising $10 million. The investment bank decides they will be issuing $1 million in shares to the public at $10 apiece. The investment bank then lists the shares on a stock exchange for the public to buy. Investors can now buy shares of Dave's food truck. In the late 1990s, IPOs really took off as technology startups were issuing stock and raising a ton of money extremely quickly. This led to the internet bubble and subsequent collapse. You can buy publicly traded companies for free on wallstreetsurvivor.com.
So that's the meaning, that's the example of the IPO. So I hope that you learn from that. Okay, the next is understanding the IPO. So we're going to elaborate the meaning of the IPO and how is it, how to understand this in the basic nature and peculiarities of the new issues market. So there are three factors that need to be understood. So ang kinaunhan is that new stock offering tend to be underpriced relative to their trading price in the market. On average, a new stock will increase by 10 to 15% on the first day the stock traded publicly. These results are even more pronounced for smaller, younger companies going public than for their older, more established counterparts. So kung naay mga new stock markets o naay mga moabutay nga bag-o, is na yung tendency nga gatong mga daan is mohina ang mga presyo kay mura man sila mas gamay ang ilahang makuha na kwarta is kay naa may bag-o. So naay mga like ang ubang tabi og nay bag-o kay ganahan sila mo try ana, di ba? Ingana mga wala bayay sana wala bayay ka walay ka humanan bayag mga ganahan sa tao. So they wanted to try new ingani nga na. So mao na siyang munya ang kato nga mga bag-o na stock is maka-increase siya by 10 to 15% nga i-traded siya publicly. So ang ikaduha is there are cycles in both volume of new issues and the size of the underpricing just mentioned. The periods of high average initial returns and high volume are known as hot issue markets. Thus, timing is terribly important when taking the firm public. So, og ganahan jud ka like, di ba maghimo jud ka og market research kon kanang sana sakto ba na siya na like oras or like day or months nga anha nimo ipagawas imong product, ipapublic nimo dapat na jud kay timing ana nga kuan kay nabayaban nga if ever like sa isda kay og magdungan-dungan siya is nay posible nga dili mahalin imuha, di ba? So kanang dapat jud timing nimo nga gamay rag isda ingana para dili ka para halin diretso. So Ikatulo is new issues tend to underperform for up to 5 years after the offering, both in terms of the firm's stock price performance. These results are even more pronounced for younger firms than for established. Okay, the next is the IPO process. So making the company public via initial public offering follows administrative processes. Following is a brief but factual description of this process. Kung ganahan ka ang imong company ma-public pinaagi sa initial public offering or sa IPO, kay naa kay mga proseso nga dapat buhaton or dapat sundon or like that. So ang kinahanglan is that it takes 6 months to 2 years ang pagproseso. Naay ang pinakasayo is 6 months kay na-organize na sila through financially and everything nga pagpakita sa IPO nga okay na ni sila. So mao ang sayo ang ilahang paghimo nga public ilang company. Naa sayo ban nga moabot pog 8 months. 6 months o 8 months maabot sila nga nao sa mahimong public ilang company. Unya nganong maabot siya og 2 years nga process o sa mo silang public is because dili pa sila organized ilang financial na pa sila yung problema ing ana nga dapat i-organize sa nila maong mo take sila og 2 years usa pa sila mahimong public. So ang ikaduha is interfacing with attorneys, auditors, underwriters, and financial printers, collecting information for the realms of documentation that need to be submitted. So nag-needed siya or like dapat na amoy ika-present na mga tao or dapat na amoy mga tao nga dapat mo imulihok sa inyong papel, mga documentation or like mga mga papel nga dapat need nga i-submit for o sana siya sa process nga dapat buhaton o ganahan ka nga mahimong public ang imuhang company. And then ang ikatulo is slideshow, product brochures, and videos will be produced and distributed. So, mo to siya, kabaw, maong nana siya yung mga, usa na siya sa ka-process nga kuan sa IPO is that, ang kanang mga slideshow, napo na siya yung mga road shows, mga product brochures, kana sila, is ihatag na siya kung ang imong company is like pila lang ka days, like 2 days usa mahimong public ay panghatag na sila og mga brochures or like magpa-advertise sila sa TV ing ana ang usa sa mga buhaton nila para manotice na ma-public na ni siya ingan og makabantay mo nga na mga bag-ong advertisement nga mo pop up ra kalit sa TV ing ana na sila wala ta kabalo nga ka pila ka days kay iga-public na days sila. And then ikaupat is that you need to answer these questions if ganahan ka nga mahimo kang public. Kung ganahan ka nga mahimong public imong company. So ang kinahanglan is that what do we need to do before going public? What are the legal requirements? Who should be responsible for the different activities and how? Should we structure our team to make it all happen? How do we choose an investment banker? How do we determine the appropriate price for the offering? How will life be different after we are a public company? So mao to siya, sayo na siya mga questions, if desidido gyud ka, if kanang kay daghan man jud dapat og kuti o ganahan kag kuan ba kay dili na siya dali-dali. So, mo na siya imong dapat nga mga buhaton o ganahan ka nga mahimong public imuhang company na kay mga pang-ansiran and it takes 6 to 2 years nga mahimo kang public. And then taking a company public is one of the most exhilarating, frustrating, stimulating and exhausting experiences owners and managers will ever encounter. So, kulba gyud siya if ganahan ka kay di ba og maghimo mayon kag public is that daghan nagtawo kanang daghan nagtawo nga mo involve or daghan nagtawo nga makabalo daghan nagtawo nga like musod or gawas ana. So daghan jud kag ma-feel nga kanang it's normal ra gyud ni siya if kanang you are into business gyud kay I think sa tanan man siguro maka-feel kag ma-frustrate ka even sa exam, di ba? Even sa test, even sa mga gipangbuhat nimo sa adlaw-adlaw na mga panagsa nga ma-frustrate ka. It's just the same when it comes to business o sa ingana o ganahan ka mahimong public jud imong company is maka-feel jud kag mga ingana. And then the IPO begins with an entrepreneur's decision to go public and take the plunge in IPO. The entrepreneur then selects an investment banker to serve as underwriter, who in return brings together a group investment house to help sell the shares. So, ang entrepreneurs gihapon ang magkuan o ganahan siya i-public ang iyang company. O niya siya po'y mag-select og like sa investment banker nga kanang tabangan siya nga ibaligya ang kato mga shares ingana if ganahan ka nga mahimong public imong company. Whenever you are negotiating, it always good to know the underlying motivation for the other side. In this case, you need to understand the investment banker's incentives for assisting with an IPO. O usa ka company, dapat mag-search jud ka or like dapat sabton jud nimo ang usa ka bank or like mag-open mo og bank account or anything nga naghisgot og kwarta o ingana isat kabalo jud mo sa mga incentives ana dapat sabton jud ninyo para walay daghang pangutana o walay daghang para dili ka maingon nga scam na siya ingana. Okay. Going public via IPO means accommodating new business owners or partners the entrepreneur has never known. So, sa pagkuan pa lang nimo nga imo ganahan ka nga public imo nga company or like business is naadjog kay makaila or like makasugat na mga negosyante sad mga bagong tag-iya sa negosyo nga wala pa nimo nahibal-an or wala pa nimo nakaila ingana. Once the firm has been sold, taken public, or merged with a larger corporation as part of the strategic alliance, and once the money or stock has changed hands, the entrepreneur is a free person. Kung ang kumpanya gibaligya na, gihiusa na sa mas dako nga korporasyon unya gikuha na sad sa publiko, ang kato nga entrepreneur is free na siya. And lastly, the entrepreneur has the financial means to do essentially what he wants to do when he wants to do it.
So Anna already discussed about what an IPO is, or the initial public offering. For more information, please watch this video, and for you also to know why does company go to public.
An IPO is an initial public offering. It's the first time a stock is offered for sale to the general population.
Now, the reason they do this is because they want to raise capital. So like most companies, they usually start out from humble beginnings and they're usually small. But as time goes on, they usually get bigger and then they require a lot more capital to operate and get to that next step, which is to become a big corporation. Part of becoming that big corporation is issuing shares into the public. So when a company first issues shares to the public, this is called the initial public offering. So when a company first issues shares into the public, they're giving up ownership or equity in return for money. You will have management operate the companies like the CEOs and the board of executives, but the ownership is with the stockholders, everyday regular people. This is essentially the very basic fundamental reason why companies go public. They need money to operate and get bigger. That's essentially it. And it often depends on the characteristic of the business. So for example, banks and airline companies are notoriously known for always being public because these are referred to as capital intensive businesses, meaning they require a lot of capital. Where do they get that capital? Well, it's best to go into the public. Why is it best to do this? Because it's free. When you go to the bank, you have to pay off debt. Where else are you going to get this money? You give equity into your company. You have no obligation to pay them back. It's a risk that a shareholder is making. They're going to ride the successes with you in the company, and they may be subject to the fall and the failures with you. Now, the process of becoming public is actually very simple to comprehend if you look at it from a broad perspective. You have a company, and they are looking to go public. At the time they are going public, they probably just have a few owners. However, when they're done with this process, they'll probably have millions. So the company does two things first. One, they go to the SEC to get authorization, and the SEC goes over the company and they authorize how many shares they can issue. This is called the authorized shares. And then they often go to one of the big investment banks, and this is what investment banks primarily specialize in. They hire the investment bank to go over all these complex financial metrics by these highly trained business professionals. And once they derive all these formulas, the investment bank decides how many shares to issue and at what price. And investment banks are usually compensated on a commission basis. The company wants to ensure that the IPO process is successful, and it's up to the investment bank to make sure that happens. So the company will only pay depending on how successful this is. There are times throughout history where an investment bank has essentially become a failure in trying to IPO a company. What would be a failure in the IPO process? It would be when they try to issue shares, nobody buys them, and therefore they don't raise the capital that they need. So when the investment bank does attract heat in the market to buy these shares, they first go through what's called the primary market. The primary market is made up of a few big institutions and key financial players that are essentially just first in line to buy up these shares. Once they exit the primary market, they enter what's called the secondary market. Now the secondary market is the market you are familiar with. This is the market that's reported on the news. This is the market that has a lot of participants and goes through the daily and minute-to-minute fluctuations. The participants in the market are institutional and retail investors, whereas in the primary market, they're mostly just authorized institutional investors. And what you have to understand is once they're in the secondary market, where the share price goes doesn't actually affect the capital raised by the company. They make their money in the primary market. Once it enters the secondary market, what happens to the share price actually doesn't affect the performance of the company. And then it becomes a reverse process. The performance of the company actually affects the shares. Now there are some funny things that happen in the financial markets. When a company is authorized amount of shares, they almost never issue them all at once. You'll see oftentimes on a stock exchange a company will have Class A shares and Class B shares and Class C shares, etc. This usually just represents different periods of time where a company has gone through a couple of IPO processes. When a company is given their authorized shares, they usually just give a small piece into the public first. They want to get a good idea of sentiment and they want to hold on to the rest of the shares for future causes. It's essentially just smart corporate governance. So this was just a short topic I wanted to cover because it's a very important part of corporate finance and the stock market, but a lot of people don't know exactly how it works.
So, to summarize, an IPO is an initial public offering. It is when the companies sell their shares to the public. First, they need authorization from the SEC or a different securities regulatory body. And then we hire investment banks goes through the process of raising capital. It goes into the primary market first, which consists of institutional investors and big key players, and it then trickles down to the secondary market, which consists of retail investors. Why do they go to public? To raise capital. And why do they need to raise capital? To expand and fund further growth and become a bigger business. So, entrepreneurs have been benefited a lot, but there are also risks in going public. There are two major disappointments mentioned by entrepreneurs who have sold their companies by going public. First, entrepreneurs lose focus and direction. They lose focus and direction which had been provided by owning a company, even for those with basic value system that reminds them that they are not their work and naadyo'y bigger chances for emotional downtime. And naapoy ubang entrepreneurs nga nagmahay nganong gibaligya nila ang ilang company even if naka-receive sila of fair price. And they came to realize that the firm serves as the base for much that what they did both in and out of the business area. So second is managing liquidity resulting from company sale becomes burden for some entrepreneurs. So in an area, they find managing liquidity difficult and less enjoyable than what they expected and less rewarding than owning their own company. So some people take out loan to buy a house and some people take out loans to buy a car. When you borrow money, it means you are in debt. In other words, you owe money. But before a bank will give you a loan, they will make a credit test. So if you do not owe money and already repaid your loans, it means you have a high credit rating or high credit score. If you owe a lot of money and haven't repaid your loans, it means you have a low credit rating or low credit score. In short, mag-base ra sila sa imong performance sa imong pag-repay sa imong loan. But there are things that bank can do para maka-make sure sila nga mabalik ang kwarta nila. So number 1 is collateral. So what do you mean by collateral? So it is something that you promise to give the bank if you can't pay your loan. So for example, si Shaina Aliago ni loan og 5 million sa bangko and iyang gipusta ang iyahang mansion dito sa Alegria. So if ever si Shaina dili ka pay sa iyahang 5 million nga giutang, so katong balay or katong mansion is foreclosed. Other one is banks may ask for cosign. So for example, si Gracia ni loan of 500,000 pesos and wala siya collateral. But ang gipangita sa bangko is someone nga mo cosign, which is if dili kabayad si Gracia sa iyahang giloan, responsible na siya or ang kana na pong ni cosign maoy mo bayad bali mo pasa. So if ever ang iyang gipa-cosign si Anafe, so kana si Anafe kung dili kabayad si Gracia, si Anafe ang magpadayon og bayad sa giloan ni Gracia.
To be able to get financing from the banks, it should be a great help that a loan applicant or an entrepreneur have a clear and ready answer to these following questions that a banker may pose. Number 1, how much money you really want to have? Number 2, what are you going to do with the money? Number 3, why is the loan needed for the business? Number 4, why do you need our depositors' money? Number 5, when will you pay back your loan? Number 6, how will you repay your loan? And number 7, what happens if your plans do not work out?
Introducing the 5 C's of credit. The 5 C's of credit is a system used by lenders to gauge the credit worthiness of a potential borrower. The system weighs 5 characteristics of the borrower and condition of the loan, attempting to estimate the chance of default. The 5 C's of credit are: character. It is the obligation that a borrower feels to repay the loan. Since there is not an accurate way to judge a character, the lender will decide subjectively whether or not you are sufficiently trustworthy to repay the loan. Capacity. It refers to your ability to meet the loan payments. The prospective lender will want you to know exactly how you intend to repay the loan. The lender will consider the cash flow from the business, the timing of repayment, and the probability of successful repayment of the loan. Capital. It is the money invested in the business and is an indicator of how much is at risk should be the business fail. Lenders will generally consider the company's debt-to-equity ratio to understand how much money the lender is being asked to lend in relation of how much the owners have invested. Conditions. It refers to the intended purpose of the loan, for example, working capital, additional equipment, or new offices. The size of loan in relation to the specific use will help the lender evaluate your loan request. Collateral. It is a form of security for the lender. Banks usually require collateral as a type of insurance in case you cannot repay the loan. If you default on the loan, then the lender takes possession of the collateral in place of the debt. These methods of evaluating a borrower incorporates a qualitative and quantitative measures. Lenders look at the borrower's credit reports, credit scores, income statement, and other documents relevant to the borrower's financial situation, and they also consider information about the loan itself.
Most entrepreneurs face. There are many options: the small business loans, investors, small business grants, self-financing, crowdfunding, but the process of zeroing in the one funding option that is the best for your business may not be clear-cut process. So, what are some things you should consider when you're looking for a capital to start for your business? So, the biggest question is, should you fund your business yourself, or should you use other people's money to get your business off the ground? Other people's money refers to the borrowed capital that is used to increase the potential returns as well as the risk of the investment. It comes in many forms, including bank loans, investors, family and friends, venture capital and angel investors, crowdfunding, and venture financing or leasing. Using other people's money also buys you time and allows you to do things in your business you may not have been able to do if you financed yourself. You have more options, increased reach, and the ability to make a bigger impact much quicker as you start a business. Author Gigi Green insinuates that if the business is successful, you will have your cash to help it grow and expand. If your business is unsuccessful, then you will have some cash left to build another business. So when we say capitalism, it is all about a system in which professional business operates, utilizes other people's money for mutual gain. He also emphasized that successful businessmen seldom operate their own money.
While capital or money is an essential requisite to undertaking an entrepreneurial endeavor by putting up a self-owned business, the lack or absence of personal capital is not necessarily a constraint to putting up a business itself. Searching an idea worth pursuing into a business or finding an opportunity for capitalists to engage into business and putting together or packaging the venture so that the business can be finally launched or take off the ground are matters that should motivate every entrepreneurial individual. When such a proposed venture is indeed worth pursuing as determined through an honest-to-goodness business plan, the financial portion of it can be addressed by other parties for as long as the entrepreneur can prove that it has profit potentials that should motivate the financier to finance the project. Of course, personal savings or other personal fund sources are the most pronounced possible sources of financing. In the absence of personal capital or equity from the initiator of the business or from within the group of persons planning to pursue the business, friends and relatives are immediate sources of capital via loan option or as direct investors to the business project. By and large, however, it is always logical and practical to enlist the support of other parties as equity holders, rather than loan providers, not only because of the risk involved in loan financing, but also because of the skills and expertise that other equity holders may have to make the business a successful venture. Other than the informal sources of business financing, a number of formal or commercial fund sources are around, such as commercial banks and venture capital corporations. For startup business, it is generally difficult to get financing package on account of lack of track record on the part of business proponents, whereas expansionary projects or innovative projects of well-established companies are likely to get financing for viable proposals. If only to finance a new business venture or launch an innovation within an existing organization, non-traditional financing scheme has to be explored to the fullest. Such fund sources are merchandise suppliers, credit card companies, and capital equipment suppliers, leasing companies, receivable factors, and other short-term lenders should also be explored by the entrepreneur. Not to be overlooked as fund sources are the various lending and livelihood, as well as industrial-level projects of the government. There are various government financing programs which can be handled by various government institutions whose financing assistance ranging from something that is micro in character to big-ticket projects under its medium and large-scale project financing. Quite often, government financial institutions are in fact a lot more easy to deal with as they are a bit more compassionate in dealing with loan lapses as compared to commercial banks. A variety of business financing abounds both in the private banking sector as well as government financial institutions. It is really up to the entrepreneur to present his proposal or business plan so that this can be funded by the appropriate organization.